most people are spending 90% of their time doing work they hate for the 10% of the work they love.
Hmm.
And if we can just change that ratio to like 50-50, you don't even know you're working anymore.
Hello, and welcome back to Off to the Valley, where we dive into the journeys of innovators shaping the future of business and technology. I'm your host, Pratik Panda, and today we have an incredible guest who has reshaped the way companies think about product development and consumer behavior, Bob Moesta. Bob is an innovator, entrepreneur, the co-creator of the Jobs to be Done framework, a methodology that has been embraced by companies like Apple, Intercom, GitLab, to just name a few, in order to build scalable consumer centric products. Over his career, Bob has worked on more than 3,500 products spanning across software, consumer goods, and even defense systems. He's co authored the Demand Side Sales 101, Learning to Build, and also teaches at Harvard, MIT, Kellogg's management schools. Bob, I could just go on about you.
Yeah. Just
And
stop. Just
it's
stop. Like this is where you don't really keep track of that stuff. You just do what you do, and then all of a sudden somebody comes back and reads it to you, and you go like that. That's like I don't understand all that, but it's true. But it's just like I'm just a regular guy, man. I'm from Detroit, so it's like just I love to build things. I've been building things for over 40 years. My mom would tell you I was an engineer out of the womb, breaking things by the time I was 3. So fixing things by the time I was 5. So I've like always had that kind of building, engineering, creating thing in me. Not so much art, but I'm moving more towards art as I get older for sure.
That is great, Bob. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, and there's so
Thank you for
much
having me.
to talk to you about. Let's start with understanding Bob a little bit more, right? You told a brief thing about your inclination towards
Yeah.
engineering and breaking
Yeah.
things. What
Yeah.
was childhood like for Bob,
Yeah.
and what were some of the formative things that you remember?
Yeah. So I started building things like I built a parachute, right? And I tried to
Wow.
make it work and I broke both my legs and was in a coma.
Oh, no.
And so I've had 3 close head brain injuries before I was 7 years old. I can't read and I can't write. And I think of about it as the greatest gift I ever got. Um, because what it did is it forced me to learn in a very different way. Because I can't read, I can't just pick up a book and learn something. And so think of it as like what like I had to master was asking people questions because the questions were the basically they were the things that actually got people to talk about what really happened and what really worked. And so I've been asking questions my whole life. I was that little kid who asked 1,000 questions. And my mom would basically say if she allowed somebody to come within 10 feet of me, I was allowed to talk to them. And so it was one of those things where I was just a sponge, but I couldn't actually learn this regular way. And so ultimately that was kind of my superpower was being able to talk to people and empathize with people and understand where they came from. And so school was very hard, though I'm probably a savant in some cases because my primary language is math, which is
Mm.
relationships and patterns and things like that. And so I can remember equations, I can remember very elaborate things, but I can't actually see words that are 7 letters or smaller.
Mm.
So, and I feel like the struggling moments were the things that enabled me to kind of reach for something better. And so every time I struggle, and I struggle today, and when I struggled before, it was like, oh, I was looking forward to it because I would always think, but the moment I acknowledged the struggle was the moment I started to solve it. And so ultimately, I knew I was always going to be learning something new if I could do that.
That is amazing, right? Like to be able to think in that direction. Have you, over the course of time, built sort
Yeah.
of a framework that you apply sort of quickly?
I have probably 25 different frameworks that I use. I pull them out all the time. I've been teaching them. So like the book Learning to Build, I wrote that book. I don't know. So how does a dyslexic write a book? Well, with a lot of people around them to help them put their thoughts, my thoughts into words. And so they basically, I had ghostwriters and interviewers. And if you read my books, it sounds like I'm speaking it because that's usually what happens. Is I just speak them and then people we transcribe it, put it into a book. But all of those things and methods, and I talk about the 5 essential skills of innovators and entrepreneurs. And, one is empathetic perspective, 2 is causal structures, 3 is uncovering demand, 4 is prototyping to learn, and 5 is learning how to make trade-offs. And if you master those 5 skills, my belief is you will be an unbelievable innovator at any level of innovation you want to work.
That is amazing. One of the frameworks that's been pretty popular and I see being
Yeah.
quoted around a lot is the Jobs to be Done framework that you
Yes.
came up with. Can you
Yes.
tell us a little bit more about that framework?
Yeah, so part of it starts with the fact is like as an engineer, I would get a bunch of research from marketing research to tell me about what we should build. And ultimately, I could never understand what they talked about because I couldn't read the report. And so I had always asked to talk to 10 people so I could actually get a feel for what they were really talking about. And out of those 10 interviews, I would get so much information that ultimately I would be able to kind of put it into like, oh, we need to go build this. And I had done that for probably almost 10 years where we just did it, but I didn't tell anybody. Then finally what happened is people kept saying like, how are you doing this? And so we slowed it down and we turned it into a method. And then I talked to Clay Christensen about it. And he basically said, we need to turn this into a theory. And so we worked on that for 20 years, if you will. And ultimately it came out in a book called Competing Against Luck. But it's the way I think. It's sad to say, but this is how my children think because this is how I would think with them. And so ultimately it's teachable and I'm able to pass it down. And I've got colleagues I work with and startups I work with to kind of pass this kind of thinking down, which is coming at it from the customer side and understanding the demand side. It's not like how to sell something, but how do people buy things and how do we get in their way and what causes them to say today's the day they need your product. And ultimately, what are they going to stop using because they buy your product? And so it's a fundamental way to look at the world, but it's not looking at the world through your product. It's looking at it through the eyes of your consumer and what are they doing? What help do they want? And where do they want to go? And how does your product help them get there?
So I want to dive a little bit on a couple of things that you said here. First is about that buying behavior, right? One of the
Yeah.
core ideas of the jobs to be done framework is that you suggest people don't just buy products, they hire them to solve a problem in their lives.
Yeah.
Help me understand what changes when you look at it from this perspective where
Yeah.
people are not just
So
buying products, but hiring products.
so a lot of people end up trying to talk about what I would say is the greatest lie I was told when I was in engineering school was build it and they will come.
Hmm.
And what I learned was that's just a crock of shit. Right? It's not true. And so I built some products where it did, and I'd go to talk to customers and they say, oh yeah, I want this and this and this. And then you go build it. And then you show it to them. They're like, no, not really that. I'd like something else. And so you keep just going round and round and you realize like they don't really even know what they want. And so how do
Right.
you actually start to tease out this thing? And so part of this is being able to take a step back and understand that one is people are creatures of habit. They would rather do the same thing over and over again than do something new. And so if that's the case, what causes people to do new things? I call it the struggling moment is the seed for all innovation because it's the moment where you realize like this is not good enough. This is not working. I got to do something else. And you have no idea what to do, but you know what you're doing right now doesn't work. And so by understanding kind of the process that people go through, the struggling moment, the what we call passive looking and then active looking and then deciding and making trade-offs and then choosing and having expectations and then basically figuring out the role of satisfaction in that. And so I've been studying people for over 30 years, maybe 40 years now, and just understanding, kind of what causes people to make a new change in their life. And so I have a new book called Job Moves, and I've been studying people for 15 years of what causes people to say today's the day they're going to leave their job in
Mm.
one company and go to another company. Because the reality is employees hire companies more than companies hire employees. And so you start to realize like what causes somebody to choose today is the day I'm going to leave this company and go somewhere else. And it's about progress. It's about basically hiring another company to help them make the progress they want to make for the reasons that they have. And they're willing to give up some trade-offs in order to basically make that progress. And so it's the same fundamental premise for your product is, there's actually no new consumption. People have to stop doing something to start using your product. And so what are people going to fire to figure that out? And so it's all that kind of thinking wrapped around it to understand what we call the demand side of the world before we talk about the supply side of what we can build.
So let's talk a little bit about identifying what your customer has to fire in order to hire
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
And a lot of founders struggle with really defining what their
Yes.
competitor product is. Usually they just
Yes.
look at other products in the same category. But like
Yes.
I've told this to so many people, like if you take Netflix as an example, their competitor, sure, in some ways also other streaming platforms like an Amazon Prime Video or Disney and so on. But their true competition is what do people do with their time.
That's
Their
right. That's
competition
right.
is are people going out for,
So,
a hike or whatever? Like if they have time, you want them to sit and watch Netflix. Mm.
so the way I think about it is there's three resources we have as human beings. We have money, we have time, and we have knowledge. And ultimately, sometimes those resources become the desired outcome. So I'll spend money and time to get knowledge, but I'll also spend knowledge to get money so I can get time.
Hmm.
And so you start to realize they're very, very independent and interdependent on that. But the first way to think about it, and I'll give you a very simple example, is most people would think that Snickers, the candy bar, and Milky Way compete with each other, right? They're both candy bars. They're both made with chocolate. They're both sit next to each other in the aisle. But when you look at how they're consumed and when they're consumed, and when do people say, today's the day I need a Snickers, and boy, no, I need a Milky Way, they actually don't compete at all. Because a Snickers takes into account the fact is one is typically you've missed the last meal,
Hmm.
your stomach is growling, your blood sugar is dropped, you literally have some work in front of you to do. And the reality is, but you don't want to spoil the next meal and you don't have time to go get a meal. It's like, I just need to mainline something to stop my stomach so I can focus and get something done. Right. Well, it turns out it competes with a Red Bull and a coffee and a sandwich and some of these other things, right? But if you look at a Milky Way, it actually is typically eaten in a situation where they're alone. Something emotional just happened. Something good might have happened, something bad might have happened, but there's something emotional about it. And typically, you're going to realize that the Milky Way competes with an ice cream and a brownie and a glass of wine, and in some cases, a run. And so you start to realize, like, even though they look like they compete with each other, at the moment of choice and the moment of consumption, they're actually completely different. And so this is where I believe that consumers have a very different set of categories than industries do. Industry categories are set usually by financial community, so you understand the cost structure and you understand the ability to make loans and do all that other stuff. And so they look for companies that have similar business models, but they're not necessarily the same customers. And so we've tried to extrapolate that supply side notion of categories into the consumer side. And most consumers don't think in categories like that.
Yeah. Talking about consumers, right? If a founder had to build this theory deeper and really understand their buyer better,
Yep.
and they
Yep.
had only, here's 10 interviews I can do with
Yeah.
my strategic customers,
Yes.
how should those interviews be structured that
Yeah.
you get the
So
right
so
value out of it?
so the first thing is to realize, like, nobody, at least as far as I can tell, nobody can predict the future. So
Mm.
going to talk to your potential customers or basically people who haven't bought about what they want. It's like I build houses, right? If I went to I talk to people about, what house do you want? They'd say, oh, I want stainless steel appliances. I want a big yard. They want it all, but they haven't made all the trade-offs required to do it. So what I do is instead of talking to people who want to buy my product, I talk to the last 10 people who bought my product and say, what in the world happened that said today's the day you're going to get rid of what and you're going to hire us? Like, and so by talking to those 10 customers who are already customers, and to be honest, I usually wait 90 days because there's a honeymoon period where they're kind of like, oh my God, I love this, or oh my God, I hate this. And so you want to get a little bit past that.
Mm.
But ultimately, you talk to 10 people who just recently bought your product and you start to learn the things that have to happen to them to make them ready to buy your product. What struggling moment did they have? What are the things that they actually kind of went through? What were the competitors that they kind of looked at? And what you start to realize is some of the biggest competitors that most companies have for software products are literally the intern and Excel.
Hmm.
And most people don't think about that as the competitor. And if you just got to be better than Excel, it's all of a sudden the product actually doesn't have to be the be all to end all. It literally just has to be better than Excel, which is actually not that hard.
Yeah.
And so you start to realize that gives you kind of a really good kind of line of sight to figure out what to build, what features you need, and what are the next things you need to add.
Got it. Let's switch gears a little bit. You're coming up with a new book called Job Moves. It's a little bit different from some of the other stuff that you've done. Tell us a little bit about this new book.
So I met a gentleman by the name of Ethan Bernstein in 2009. Clay Christian was his academic advisor for his PhD at Harvard. And he is in the organizational behavior side. And he basically came and saw me do a interview process around how people buy products. And he realized that at some point in time, like, this is the same conversation should be having with my students about helping them figure out their career. Cause I just left a coaching situation and I should have asked, Like, why now? What are you looking at? Like all these questions. And so he approached me to talk about that. And so over the last 15 years, we've done over 1,000 interviews. We talked to people who recently switched jobs, and we did it from everybody who switched from Chipotle to McDonald's to, a lawyer, a partner in a law firm to becoming a judge and everything in between. And ultimately trying to look at what are the causal factors that cause people to say, today's the day. I need to basically go find something different. And out of it, we discovered, I think is like 26 or 27 pushes and pulls, or like actions that have to happen to them and outcomes that they're hoping for. And they've actually collapsed down into 4 unique patterns that help you describe kind of what's your next move of where you want to go next. Right. And out of that, then we built a process to help you kind of understand kind of a little bit who you are, what you're about, what you're good at, what you suck at, what gives you energy, what sucks your energy. So you can start to describe kind of like where you want to be. And what you start to realize is most people are spending 90% of their time doing work they hate for the 10% of the work they love.
Hmm.
And if we can just change that ratio to like 50-50, you don't even know you're working anymore.
Hmm.
And so part of it is helping. So the book is written not from an employer perspective, but from an employee perspective, because 1 billion people a year switch jobs. And almost like half of them end up in a position where they don't actually like the job, and they know it within the first 3 weeks. And so how do we actually help people make better decisions about that? And so it's this aspect of how many people really need to know jobs to be done? Maybe 100,000, but how many people need help basically finding a better job? Oh, about 1 billion. And so
Yeah.
what I've been doing now is basically kind of switching it from trying to teach people the method to literally building products and services wrapped around it, so it helps people make progress in their life. Because ultimately, that's the main objective of any product, is to help people figure out how to get through a struggling moment and make progress.
That's amazing. If I switch that from an employer's lens, or especially because so
Yeah.
many of our listeners are
Yes.
startup founders, one of the things that, I mean, it's true for any organization of any size. It's a difficult time when people leave. You
Yes.
have to
Yes.
reorganize and so on. But I think it hits smaller startups a lot more.
Yeah.
As founders, is there something they can identify certain
So,
patterns that
so there's 2
somebody might?
things. So for example, I started 2 new startups in 2024. And what I would say is the first thing I did is I used the books to actually recruit my co-founders and the first 2 employees. So it's
Mm,
to understand what drives them and what energies they need and what environment they need to be in to be ridiculously successful. The other part is I've been using it to run I have a design studio. And in that design studio, I've been using it to basically ask people about what do they struggle with? What does progress mean for them? And every year we sit down and talk about what does progress mean and what's missing from what they think is part of their job. So I have a series of pushes that we hear about, like, have you been disrespected, or, are you bored, or basically you don't see a place to go. It's like, there's these different things. And so part
mm,
of it is helping people kind of identify those things. And then, for example, one of the people I work with came from the educational space, and she really misses being with students. And so it's that notion of mentoring and being with students and doing that kind of thing. And so one of the things we talked about as well, let's go find a side gig that you can go do this with. And she says, well, I'll become a big sister for somebody. I'm like, that's perfect. And
yeah,
so as she does that, I tell her, like, when you take your little sister out, it's like, you've got to realize that's part of work, because at some point you wouldn't stay here if you didn't have that as part of your job. And so knowing what the things are and what are the struggling moments and what progress people want to make is really, really important. And to understand, we keep trying to filter people because they have the experience. But
yeah,
the reality is, what we really want to do is find people who want to actually lean deeply into the area where we need the work. And you're looking for people, what people can do, not for what they did.
yeah.
Right. And so ultimately, and just because I'm good at something doesn't mean I like to do it. Right. That's
That's
the
true.
other thing that we have to actually kind of figure into it. So the book kind of outlines those kinds of things. And the last 3 chapters are really about coaching. And then basically, from an employment perspective, how do we think about running a very different kind of recruiting process than typically how people do it, which is like, let me get a bunch of resumes, let me write a job description. Then you start to realize job descriptions are made up, and resumes are literally like a description of a superhero. And you
Yeah,
end up trying to picking on basically some made up job description of what the work is, which you really don't know what it is. And you match it with a superhero, and next thing you know, it's like it doesn't work. And you're like,
yeah,
why is this so bad? And what most of the companies have been innovating on is how do I get more resumes? How do I get more better jobs? They're innovating all in the wrong space.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, and again, like you said, I've never been in the space before. I didn't really want to go into the space, but when you ask founders, like the top three things that if they could wave a magic wand with and make it disappear, talent and HR is one of them.
Yeah,
They would
definitely.
really like to be a better, and that's really why I wrote it. And to be honest, that's why I recruited people like Michael Horn and Ethan Bernstein, who are experts in that area. But me coming from the outside going like, this makes no sense.
Yeah. I think that you said a couple of very interesting things that resonate strongly because right now I'm hiring for a role and I've been hiring for more than a decade, but this is the first time when I'm actually asking one of the things that you mentioned is
Yeah.
I ask people that, hey, you're a product marketer. There are certain things you have to do and you might be good at it. Do you
Yeah.
enjoy doing it?
Yeah. Yeah.
What are things that you enjoy doing versus what are some things that you are good at, but because the job requires you to do it?
What I would tell you is I've been more forceful than that. What are the things that give you energy? You walk into the situation
Yeah,
and you end up with more energy than you started with. Like, how does that happen? And then
that's amazing.
where are the times where you walk into a situation and literally you feel the life energy being sucked out of your body? Like the more you can be just very and it's more about tell me moments where that happens because it's not just the work. It can be the conditions, it can be the situation, it can be context, it can be the outcome is too great. Like what are the things that actually suck the energy out of you is really important to know. And so I think those are really good questions to ask, but I would tell you to be more aggressive on what are those energy drivers and drains because I felt like they'd give me kind of half answers, but I wouldn't get to the source. You want to get to the source and know the source.
And from what I'm hearing is this is an ongoing process if you're a founder or a manager or whatever, as you do all of this when you hire the right person, but you
Yep.
continue to have these
Yes.
conversations to make sure
And
that, yeah, it still works.
yeah, and I think the thing is at some point there's I will tell you this is that when the startup gets to a certain point, you actually need different people. There's people who you need to create the business and then people to help manage the business. And usually the creative people who create the business or build the business aren't they usually people. So when you get to a point where you've got a regular runway and now it's about continuous improvement as opposed to basically creation of new features, you just start to realize like, okay, I got to have a different kind of person. And so even the people who are the startup people know it's like it's time for me to go because this is not the work I need to do. And so it doesn't become like, oh, how do I get rid of this person? It's more like, how do we go help you find to do work that you really love to do?
Yeah,
Right.
that's amazing. We talked a little bit about asking the right questions. And in
Yeah.
this context, we were talking about employers and employees,
Yeah.
but also applies so strongly to customers.
Yes.
You mentioned that customers often don't know or even lie
Yeah.
about what they really want.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
what are some techniques that founders can use to sort of
Yeah.
scratch below those surface level
Yep.
answers and find out?
So the first thing is the process I call is unpacking.
Hmm,
And I think of three layers of language. There's three kinds of language that people talk at you with. And the first thing is to realize that most people listen with more precision than the people speaking the language to you.
mhm,
So they'll say a word like easy, and you're like, "Oh, it's all about easy," and it's like they're just saying easy, like it's not that intentional, and you're taking it as very intentional. So this is where you have to start to realize, like, you have to actually start to mirror their intention behind it, right? And so there's the three layers. Of the first layer is what I call the pablum layer, and it's kind of like so I have four children, and they all work in tech, and when I catch up with them, I'll say, "How's work?" Right, and they'll say, "Oh, it's good." Like,
yeah,
that's pablum. That's the standard answer that you say that literally gets you past that question that literally says, I don't really want to tell you what's really going on, but like, it's good. Right. And the question is, they could say it's good with a pause in it, or they could say, oh, it's good with no pause in it. And that's a very
mm,
different next question. So you have to listen to not only what they say, but how they say it.
mm,
The next question is usually then a layer of what I call the fantasy nightmare layer. I'm like, oh, it's good. Tell me something that happened this week that was great about it. And this is where they exaggerate, like, "Oh my god, this happened, it was so amazing, and this happened, and that happened." And then ultimately, the fact is or, "Boy, this happened," they go really negative on it. But there's this middle layer that I call the fantasy nightmare layer, which is still nothing you need to respond to, but you have to realize, like, they need to go through it to get down to the next layer, which is the causal layer. And so you have to realize, like, and the causal layer is about what happened. What physically, were you disrespected? Were you excited because there was a new opportunity? Like what actually physically happened? And so it's more like a criminal interrogation. Like Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference, is awesome for this, right?
Mhm.
And it's about learning how to actually mirror and match. It's learning how to get the answer no. So, for example, one of the things I'll say is the moment they say yes, there's no other question. But the moment they say no, there's like, well, tell me more.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Give me an example, right? And so half the time I'm not trying to get to the version of yes that I understand. I'm trying to get to the version of no because they can keep going. And when there's no more no's, then ultimately the fact is I understand everything. And so that's really counterintuitive because most people are getting to say like, oh, so it's this and this and this, and they'll say yes.
Yeah.
And what I'll do is I'll say, no, it's this and that and those. And they'll say, oh, no, that's not it. And then they'll tell me more.
That's
And so
interesting.
it's, yep.
Because by design of thought, a lot of founders that I've worked with, and I've done these mistakes in the past as well, where you go in
We all
with
have. We all have.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
let's be
you
clear.
go
It's
in
like
with a
I've only learned this because I couldn't do it before.
yeah, we go in with these things that we want to get validated, and we're sort of unconsciously looking for those yeses, and
That's
we
right.
go back happy saying, "Oh yeah,
That's right.
this is I've achieved some sort of
So
validation."
one of the rules I talk about for jobs to be done is this notion of it's hypothesis building research.
Hmm.
All you're going to go in with is you know that they bought your product. You have no idea why. You have no idea. Like this is where somebody will say, "Oh, I bought a new car. I bought it because I got a great deal on it." That's not why they bought a new car.
Hmm.
That is, it has a virtually very small part to do with the new car. Is like, oh, I had a repair that was 6 months ago that was literally $3,000, and now I start to hear a new sound. And oh, I'm driving 30 miles a day one way to work, and I got to have a more reliable. That's why they're buying a car. But they're saying they got a deal on it, and that's why they bought a new car. And that's just a lie they tell themselves.
Yeah, that's amazing. You've given a few examples in your jobs to be done framework, and one of the companies you worked with was Intercom,
As you
very
know,
popular in this SaaS space. You mentioned that they were able to sort of grow almost 5x in 18 months by repositioning their product. Do you remember a little
yeah.
more anecdotes from that
Yeah. So it was
example?
actually they grew 15. They went from 5 million to 75 million in 18 months,
Wow.
right? And part of it was that they had the belief that their product, so the positioning of the product was, and they built it on this premise of having all the data in one place. As you are a startup back in the day, you'd actually have like 3 or 4 different kind of solutions and none of them talk to each other. And so it was this aspect of trying to get all the data in one place, and people were going to value more the fact that it was all in one place than the fact is that you had a great set of just individual tools. And so they got to, for year one, 3.5 million. Year two, they were about 5 million, but it was like kind of like the growth wasn't like in the same trajectory. They're like, okay, we should kind of look and see why people are hiring us. Well, it turns out there were 5 or 4 very, very different reasons why people were buying it. And it related back to kind of like, hey, I've got people coming to the site, but they're not actually converting. Help me convert. So it turns out it was like, help me, basically convert people. Another one's like, I don't have a problem converting, but I have a problem engaging, like having them come back and knowing what to do and knowing how to actually streamline the flow. So the engagement was a real problem.
Mm.
Another one was like, we're trying to build out features, and you had product people buying it to say like, I need to know where it's struggling so I can build new feature sets. So help me learn about where to build the next set of features. And then there was a group of people that basically said, we use this to manage our support tickets. And it's like, wait, what? We had no idea what they were doing there. And ultimately, it turns out that there was these four really different jobs. And job one, which was this engagement one, competed with HubSpot. And job four, which was help me with support, competed with Zendesk. And so you started to realize like very, very different kinds of combinations. But ultimately, they basically said instead of having, and they used to sell all the different features under one hat, but people were only using it under one of the 4 situations. And so what we did is they broke it into, they called them packages to begin with, and eventually they turned them into 4 different products and said, here's when you're struggling with these things and you want these outcomes, we can help you with that. And all they really did was then turn off feature sets to basically subgroup the product. And so they didn't really build 4 products. They actually just reduced the main product to basically focus on these 4 different use cases, if you will, or the jobs. And then ultimately, the fact is they came back to being able to advertise for it. And it turns out that back in the day, and it's changed now, but back in the day, people were problem aware, but they were solution unaware. And so the cost of being able to talk about CRM or talking about all these different tools, but if you talked about the problem, it was actually 1/10 the price of the solution words. And so we actually really won by actually making people aware of the struggling moment and describing the struggling moment so clearly. Like, it's almost the fact of like, you know what I'm struggling with so much better than I can even articulate. You must have an answer for it. And that's how they grew.
That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that in detail. Bob, as we come closer to the end of this conversation,
Yeah.
I hate to say we are coming to the end of the
Yeah,
conversation,
that's
but
all right.
as we sign off, for all the founders, especially SaaS founders listening to this, what are some top 2 or 3 things that you would advise that they focus on while they're building their product and really finding new customers?
Yeah. So the first thing I would tell you is progress over perfection. Like, I can't tell you enough that most people look at, like, they'll set a goal of what they have to hit. And what you want to do is, I want you to focus more on basically where you're coming from and did you make progress in the last 6 weeks, as opposed to did you hit your goal?
Mm.
Because for me, I don't set many goals. I set a direction and a magnitude of where I want to go. And then I take everything into 6 week cycles. And so it
Okay.
allows me, and to be honest, every time let's say in January, I'll write down, here's where I want to go, and I'll leave it alone and I'll forget about it. I almost always exceed all my goals because I just worry about the next 6 weeks, and then I'm headed in the right direction and I'm focused on making the most progress with that 6 weeks. Two is the fact is to basically study your customer from their eyes, what they see, what they hear, what they feel, and study the buying process. How do they buy? Because your sales process is not the same as their buying process. And you need to learn to ask them, how do they want to buy and what's the process to buy? Because that's the ultimate thing. I wrote a book on this called Demand Side Sales, realizing that we all sell because at some point we're all trying to help people make progress. And so teachers sell the lesson to the student still has to make the progress. Doctors sell the rehab program to the patients. They still have to make the progress. So ultimately, how do we understand how people want to make progress? And then how do we get in their way to help them? Those are the two big ones.
That's amazing, Bob. Thank you so much for taking out time and sharing all of these
Oh, no, this
insights.
is my pleasure. I measure my life, by the way. Craig Christensen, who's one of my mentors, wrote a book called How Will You Measure Your Life?
Hmm.
And ultimately, it's about how many people I can help. So it's not the size of my bank account or the number of products I've built or anything like that. It's about literally the number of people I help. So I appreciate you, like, offering to have me on and be able to talk to people so I can actually, you give me scale to be able to reach my goal of helping 1 million people. So
Thank you
I
so
really,
much,
truly
Bob.
appreciate that.
It's amazing. Once again, you've got the new book coming out, Job Moves,
Yep.
for everybody listening. If you want to understand more about how to find the right job, how to ask the right
Yeah. Yeah.
questions, and even from an employer perspective to really understand what your employees go through, I think
Yeah. So I wrote the book a lot around employees, but now I have probably 10 companies that I'm helping with just so I see another book coming around kind of the opposite side of this. And it's
mm,
almost match.com. How do we get, both sides to understand what each other wants and basically figure out how to build alignment?
that's amazing. Thanks again, Bob.
Yep. Thank you.
And that wraps up today's episode. Before we sign off, I would like to thank you for your support and thanks for tuning in. If you loved today's episode, then don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and never miss an episode. Be kind, be happy, challenge the norm. I'll see you folks again for the next one.